Joe Biden knew that as he touched down in Israel, this was going to be an issue that was going to dominate the agenda, because in the hours before he got on Air Force One yesterday, we started hearing those reports and started seeing those images of that huge explosion at the Al-Ali hospital there in northern Gaza. Now, Palestinian officials on the ground say that many people were killed and injured, some of whom were sheltering at the hospital because they believed that to be a safe place, and they have blamed an Israeli airstrike for this. Now, the IDF says that it was not to blame. It has been obviously bombing thousands of targets in Gaza over the last week or so in retaliation for those horrific terrorist attacks we saw on October 7. But Israel says that this explosion was caused by a rocket that misfired when it was launched by the Islamic Jihad group in Gaza. So two very different versions of events. Joe Biden knew that at some point he would have to publicly state who he believed was responsible for this blast. And shortly after touching down, speaking with the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he gave his assessment.
I was deeply saddened and outraged by the explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday. And based on what I've seen, it appears as though it was done by the other team, not you.
And he was later asked why he could be so sure about that. He said it was due to the information that had been given to him by the Pentagon. And the White House later said that information included things like aerial images, intercepts, and also open source information. But given the security situation there, it's very unlikely that anyone will see any independent observers there. So getting a clear read on that situation could be difficult for some time. But certainly Joe Biden making it clear which version of events he believes.
Absolutely. Now, Nick, another major focus of Mr Biden's trip was trying to get more aid into Gaza. He appears to have made some inroads on that front.
That's right. Since Israel enacted its total blockade of the Gaza Strip, humanitarian groups, the UN groups like the World Health Organization say that the situation there in Gaza has gone from bad to worse. They say there are huge shortages of things like food and water, electricity and fuel to power generators as well. And despite aid convoys waiting on the Egyptian side at the Rafah crossing to get into Gaza, we really haven't seen any movement over that border yet. And so the Israeli government, shortly after Joe Biden wrapped up his meeting, said that following a request from the US president, it will not stand in the way of the aid getting across the border. So that aid includes, according to Israel, food, water and medicine. But they say that no aid will enter the Gaza Strip from Israel. That is until all of the hostages that Hamas took earlier this month are returned.
And that standoff well and truly continues. Nick, thank you. So Carrington Clark, over to you. Protests have erupted around the world, more protests. What can you tell us on that front?
Yeah, well, the second part of the US president's trip to the Middle East was supposed to be in Amman in Jordan, where he was supposed to meet the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, and then also the Egyptian president and the King of Jordan. That was cancelled in light of that explosion at that hospital. And instead of a meeting between the US president and Arab leaders, what we've seen erupt are further protests across the neighbours of Israel, but also across the pan-Muslim world in places like Turkey and Morocco and Libya. And it's continuation really of what we've been seeing over the last couple of weeks. But we've also had protests in Europe, and I can see at the moment there is a protest in a office building attached to the US Capitol here in Washington, DC. That's led by a Jewish group, but they're pro-Palestinian. But just kind of shows how this is spreading as an issue. And this is one of the great difficulties for the US president, because his trip was curtailed, because he wasn't able to do the second part of the trip where he was planning to meet Arab leaders. It's unfortunately looking quite one-sided to people on the pro-Palestinian side of the ledger, who believes that he has gone to Israel, met with victims of that horrific terrorism attack, but didn't pay as much attention to the Palestinian plight as he should have been.
And meantime, Carrington, the US vetoed a United Nations resolution that would have urged a humanitarian pause. What happened there?
Yeah, so this was a resolution sponsored by Brazil. It called for this humanitarian pause in Gaza in order to allow humanitarian aid to flow. But America, as one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, has the ability to veto any resolution, and as it has often done in the past when it comes to resolutions that it believes unfairly target Israel, has vetoed. Now, this was the explanation given by the United States ambassador to the United Nations.
We are on the ground doing the hard work of diplomacy. And while we recognize Brazil's desire to move this text forward, we believe we need to let that diplomacy play out, especially when Secretary General Guterres, President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and regional actors are engaged in intensive dialogue on the very issues we are deliberating on today. Yes, resolutions are important, and yes, this council must speak out, but the actions we take must be informed by the facts on the ground and support direct diplomacy efforts that can save lives. The council needs to get this right.
So unfortunately, as tensions continue to rise in the Middle East, it appears that the United Nations, which was really set up exactly for circumstances like this, is unable to act.